The sky above Chicago was low and gray that morning, the kind of heavy sky that seemed to mirror the weight some people carried in their hearts. For Danielle Thomas, it was just another day of facing the impossible. She had woken up before sunrise, careful not to make noise that would wake her 5-year-old son, Caleb, curled up beside her. The sheets were threadbare, the bedroom small, the silence inside their tiny one-bedroom apartment thick, but peaceful, at least for the moment. Danielle sat with her folded resume, smoothing it out on the wooden kitchen table she'd rescued from a curbside furniture giveaway 6 months ago. She stared at the words on the paper. Her education, her skills, her worth, all written in formal fonts that never seemed to open any doors. Today's interview at Harper and Lane was supposed to be different. It was a glimmer, maybe even a crack, of light, a rare in-person interview at a high-profile marketing firm known for its innovation. The woman on the phone who confirmed the interview sounded hopeful. "You've got an interesting background," she had said. Hope was dangerous currency for people like Danielle, but she held on to it anyway. She had planned everything. Caleb's breakfast, a clean outfit, the babysitter who agreed to come early. She'd even ironed her clothes the night before and paid for extra bus fare just in case. But then, like life often does, reality broke in without mercy. The babysitter canceled. A text half an hour before she was to arrive. Her cousin, who would sometimes help out, didn't pick up. Danielle's heart sank. A storm of anxiety brewed quietly in her chest. She stood in the center of their kitchen, phone in her hand, mind spinning. Should she reschedule? No, they might not give another chance. Should she not go at all? No, she needed this. They needed this. Caleb was watching her from the corner of the room, still in his pajamas, munching dry cereal from his dinosaur cup. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked with those big, curious brown eyes that always carried more understanding than most adults she knew. Danielle looked at her son. "Do you want to go on an adventure today?" she asked, smiling softly despite everything breaking around her. He grinned and nodded. She dressed him in his best, a clean polo shirt, tiny suspenders he loved, and packed a little bag with a book and some snacks. He took her hand as they walked out of the apartment, down 3 flights of worn steps, and out into a world that never seemed to welcome them fully, but still hadn't broken them. The bus ride was quiet. Danielle rehearsed her answers in her head over and over. Caleb leaned on her shoulder, reading the same page of his book for 15 minutes. She hoped the firm wouldn't mind him waiting in the lobby. Just 20 minutes. That's all she needed to prove herself. She wasn't looking for pity, only opportunity. Harper and Lane's building was sleek and modern. Danielle had passed by it once on her lunch break, while working downtown. She remembered looking up at it and whispering, "One day, I'll walk through those doors for something more." And now, here she was. She walked in with quiet confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The reception area was all white walls, glass fixtures, and velvet chairs. Behind the desk sat 2 white female assistants, both dressed sharply. One looked up, her perfectly arched brow raised slightly as she glanced at Caleb. Danielle stepped forward, still holding her son's hand. "Hi, my name is Danielle Thomas. I have a 10 a.m. interview with Ms. Whitmore." The assistant didn't offer a warm smile. Instead, her eyes drifted back to Caleb. "You brought your kid?" Danielle stayed calm. "Yes, just for a bit. He'll sit quietly right here with me. I didn't want to miss the opportunity." "Right," the woman cut in, already scribbling on a form. Another assistant, within earshot, mumbled under her breath, "This ain't a daycare." It should have been a moment Danielle could overlook, but she felt it deep in her chest. The chill, the judgment, not from what she did, but from who she was. They gave her the clipboard and told her to wait. She sat down with Caleb beside her, smiling at him to mask her rising anxiety. All around them, people in suits walked by, mostly white, mostly unbothered. Danielle's heart beat louder with every passing second, praying for the chance to just get to the interview room, to talk, to be seen. But 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, a woman in her 50s, dressed in stiff navy business wear and holding a clipboard, walked out from the back. She looked around until her eyes landed on Danielle and Caleb. She didn't hide her disapproval. "Ms. Thomas?" she asked sharply. "Yes," Danielle stood. The woman pursed her lips. "We were expecting a more professional arrival." Danielle forced a polite tone. "I apologize. My babysitter fell through, but I didn't want to miss the appointment. My son is incredibly well-behaved, and I was hoping—" "I'm sorry," the woman interrupted. "It's against company policy. Bringing a child to an interview shows poor judgment. We're looking for someone dependable and focused. Maybe next time, come alone." Her words weren't loud, but the room felt suddenly silent. Danielle stood frozen. The humiliation burned her skin like frostbite. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice almost trembling, but she caught herself. Caleb stood up beside her, clutching her hand. "Mama, are we going?" The woman turned without another word and walked away, heels clicking coldly down the hallway. Danielle felt the walls judge her, the glass windows, the pristine chairs, the gum-smacking receptionist, and the man in the corner with a curled lip pretending not to notice. She swallowed her pain the way she'd been taught to as a girl. She didn't cry or scream or plead. She'd been dismissed in far too many ways to feel shock anymore. The familiarity of rejection was like an ache in her bones. She turned slowly toward the door. They didn't want to see her. Not her extra degrees. Not her side projects. Not her creative ideas. They just saw a black single mom, and in their world, that meant unprofessional, unworthy, inconvenient. As they stepped toward the exit, hand in hand, Caleb looked up. "Mama, did I mess it up?" That question, so gentle, so deeply innocent, shattered the last piece of her that wanted to stay strong in that moment. She stopped walking and leaned down, pulling him into both arms. "No, baby," she whispered into his soft curls. "You're the only thing in this world I've ever gotten right." And as she stood, prepared to walk away from another cracked dream, what she didn't know, what nobody around her knew, was that someone had seen it all. Someone who could change everything. And he was standing just beyond the glass wall, watching and listening. The lobby doors swung shut behind Danielle, but the sting of humiliation followed her like a cold wind she couldn't shake off. She held Caleb's hand as they stepped onto the sidewalk, her breath escaping her lips in uneven waves. The clouds above had darkened even more, and small drops of rain began to find their way onto the shoulder of her blouse. But she didn't feel the water. All she felt was the crushing weight of what had just happened. Another door closed. Another no. Another moment where it didn't matter how many hours she spent tailoring her resume, how long she practiced interview questions, how hard she fought to show up when the world gave her every reason not to. The world didn't see a professional woman. It didn't see her degree in communication or the freelance gigs she worked on late at night after Caleb went to sleep. It didn't see a mother doing her best while carrying a world of responsibility on her shoulders with no support and no net to catch her if she fell. The world only saw what it wanted to see: a black woman, alone, with a child, and it had already made up its mind. They had reduced her to a stereotype in seconds. Label her unprofessional for being a mother. Label her unqualified, without reading a single word of her resume. Danielle stood near the curb, tried to breathe through her disappointment without letting Caleb feel the sadness radiating off her skin like heat from a stove. "Are we going home now?" Caleb asked, his voice small, barely audible. She looked down at him and forced a smile, the kind that curled painfully but kept her dignity intact. "Yes," she said softly, brushing rain from his forehead. "Let's go." They began walking in silence. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around you with a tight grip, not uncomfortable, but heavy. Caleb squeezed her hand a little tighter. He had seen what happened, even if he didn't understand it. And Danielle knew that someday he would. Someday he would learn that the color of his skin, his mother's strength, and the kindness in their hearts would not always be the first thing people saw. And that thought haunted her. This wasn't the first time she had been looked at like this. It wasn't even the 10th. Job interviews, school PTA meetings, even in grocery stores. She was always met with quiet stares, subtle sneers, and sometimes outright verbal cuts that left emotional bruises. Like the teacher who asked her in front of parents if she was raising Caleb alone, or his dad in the picture, or the landlord who asked if she could really afford a rent, even after Danielle presented months of bank statements. No matter how much she achieved, it was never enough to erase the judgments born the moment people looked at her skin, her situation, and made assumptions. She thought back to last Christmas when Caleb asked why Santa brought the other kids at school more toys. She told him, maybe Santa gives kids what they need more than what they want. But deep down, she knew the truth. Life wasn't fair. It was filtered, sectioned, and coded, and black mothers like her were always forced to code switch just to be heard, swallow pride to be seen, and hustle twice as hard to be treated half as fair. She often wondered why kindness, genuine human kindness, felt so rare when you're black, poor, and asking for a chance. At the bus stop, Danielle rummaged through her purse for her last fare. She had just enough for 2 rides home, but she wasn't thinking about today. She was thinking about tomorrow, about groceries, about next week's rent. Then a voice interrupted her spiral. "Excuse me, miss, is everything all right?" Startled, Danielle looked up to see an elderly woman standing nearby beneath a bright pink umbrella. She was white, maybe in her late 70s, with pale eyes and softly wrinkled skin. The woman didn't look at her with judgment or suspicion, just curiosity and something else. Compassion. Danielle managed a faint nod. "Yes, ma'am. We're just heading home." The woman looked at Caleb. "You have a handsome boy there. Polite, too." Danielle smiled, more genuinely this time. "Thank you. He's my whole world." There was a pause. Then the woman reached into her purse and pulled out 2 bus fare tokens. "Here," she said gently. "I don't know what you're going through, but if I can make part of your journey easier, I'd like to." Danielle was stunned for a second, not by the gesture, but by how rare it felt to be met with kindness without conditions. She wanted to say no out of pride, but something about this woman, her gentleness, her sincerity, allowed Danielle to let her guard down for just a moment. "Thank you," Danielle said, her voice cracking even beneath the simple word. "You remind me of my daughter," the older woman said. "She passed away a few years ago. She was a single mom, too. It's the hardest job in the world, isn't it?" Danielle nodded quietly, her eyes glistening as the bus approached. She boarded, still clutching Caleb's hand, still carrying the weight of rejection, but also now a glimmer of warmth, a reminder that kindness, though rare, still existed in unexpected places. As the bus rattled on, passing rows of office buildings and brightly lit cafes, Danielle sat in thought. She replayed the moment in the Harper and Lane lobby over and over, the way the receptionist looked at her like she didn't belong, the way the HR manager dismissed her like ripping up paper. It was exhausting, carrying ambition and injustice at the same time. She looked out the window and didn't notice the black town car that had pulled out of the parking garage of Harper and Lane and began following quietly 2 cars behind. Inside that car sat a man in a tailored suit, watching the back of the city bus with interest. He had seen what happened, not just from behind a glass, but from a place deeper, through eyes that had once been wide open, hungry, thoughtful, and raised by a black woman whose laughter echoed in his memory like Sunday music. He hadn't said a word then, but silence, as he learned long ago, was a choice too. And today, he would make a different one. Because something in Danielle's eyes told him that maybe, just maybe, the world needed fewer interviews and more second chances. The bus kept moving, but Danielle's thoughts were stuck in one place. She sat in her seat, holding Caleb close as he rested his head against her. Every bump in the road brought back the words from that office. Sharp, quiet little cuts disguised as professional etiquette. "We were expecting someone more professional. This isn't a daycare. You should have come alone." Each sentence rattled again in her heart, bruising not just her pride, but her will. Because she knew she wasn't just fighting for a job. She was fighting for dignity, for value, for the right to dream. And in that lobby of perfection and power, she had been made to feel like her motherhood made her less. But still, she had shown up. She still wore resilience like perfume, not loud, but lingering in every room she entered, even if those rooms didn't recognize it. What she didn't know was that she hadn't just entered a room. She had entered someone's silence, and silence was about to speak. Hidden behind the glass wall upstairs, a man had watched it all unfold. Jonathan Reed, CEO and co-founder of Harper & Lane, was a name known in business circles for success, intellect, and strategy. But to people in his private life, he was known as something else, a man of few words but deep private convictions. And one of the strongest among them was this: never forget who you were before you had everything. Jonathan had arrived earlier than usual that morning, annoyed, to be honest, at a last-minute board meeting. What he witnessed in the lobby, however, erased every other thought from his mind. He had seen the young black woman walk in. She was holding a hand of a little boy, eyes full of light, clothes modest but clean. He recognized the polite nod she gave to the receptionist and saw the way it was returned with disdain. He had seen the HR manager, someone he trusted, speak to her not like a professional but like a problem. He watched the woman's face harden, her hands squeeze into fists softened only by the small fingers of her son wrapped around hers. Most of all, he had seen what no one else in that building chose to see: the quiet dignity of someone who showed up in spite of circumstances. To Jonathan, that little boy in suspenders wasn't distraction. He was evidence of perseverance, love, and the cost of showing up. Something stirred inside him that hadn't stirred in years. He thought of Mama Rose, the black woman who raised him from age 5 when his biological mother left. She was paid to take care of him, but she had loved him like her own. He remembered how she'd show up to school events while others' parents didn't, the way she'd sit quietly in the back while other white parents whispered about the help attending PTA meetings. She'd always tell him gently afterward, "People may look down on you, baby, but don't look down on yourself." And now, decades later, that look, the one Danielle carried out with her in silence, that was the same look Mama Rose used to wear when the world made her feel invisible. It lit something up in him. An hour passed. Then, too, Jonathan had work to do. But he couldn't look away from the memory of that moment. So he did something he rarely did. He checked the sign-in sheet downstairs, found her name, and called his executive assistant right away. "Danielle Thomas," he said. "Yes, sir," the assistant replied, confused. "She was here for an interview," he said. "Get me her resume." "But she was dismissed," the assistant replied cautiously. HR said, "Get me the resume," he repeated without raising his voice, but with a tone that said he didn't need negotiation. When he read it, he was stunned. Bachelor's in Communications with honors. Freelance experience on social campaigns for a local nonprofit that increased their community engagement by 80%. Letters of recommendation from 2 professors and a pastor who practically sang her praises. And nowhere, not one single word about the pain behind her smile. Jonathan stared out the window, watching traffic flow like restless waves. He wasn't just looking at a resume anymore. He was looking at someone else's story, one that deserved to be rewritten. The knock came on Danielle's door that Friday afternoon. She had just returned from picking Caleb up from his Head Start program and was preparing for her weekend shift. Still dressed in her burgundy work polo worn soft from 1,000 washes, she looked suspiciously through the peephole. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door slowly and was met by a smiling young woman in business attire, holding a clipboard with a Harper & Lane logo faintly printed at the top. "Hi, Miss Thomas," the woman said politely. "I'm here for Mr. Jonathan Reed's office." Danielle blinked. "I'm sorry, who?" "Mr. Reed, the CEO of Harper & Lane. He's requested to meet with you in his office tomorrow afternoon. He read your resume personally and would like to discuss an opportunity." Danielle stood frozen, unsure if this was real or some elaborate joke. The woman continued, "He also wanted me to assure you that Caleb is more than welcome to join. He said to tell you, some of the best decisions I've ever made were while sitting next to child." Tears stung Danielle's eyes, uninvited but unstoppable. She didn't know how he had seen her, how he had noticed in a sea of people who turned away. But someone had, just when she thought the world was done listening. Someone had chosen to speak. And not just anyone. Someone with power, with voice, with position. Someone who could offer her not a pity card, but an open door. That night, while Caleb was asleep beside her, Danielle sat at their tiny kitchen table once again. Only this time, her hands didn't tremble with doubt. They shook instead with something else, something less familiar, but deeply needed. Hope. She didn't know what would happen in that meeting. She didn't know if it would lead to a real job or just be words dressed in good intentions. But for the first time in a long time, someone had seen her not as a single mother too desperate to be taken seriously, but as a woman who still mattered, as a professional, as enough. The rain had stopped by the time dawn arrived. Where once the sky held only the color of gray, now it blushed faintly gold. Tomorrow wasn't promised, but it was finally possible. And sometimes that's all you need. The sun, for the first time in days, had broken through the clouds. Golden streaks poured through the window panes of Danielle's small apartment, as if heaven itself had decided to spotlight her. She stood in front of the mirror with her nerves hidden under a layer of foundation and a modest navy blazer. Her hands trembled slightly as she fixed the collar, smoothing it down again and again. Today was different. Something about it carried the air of beginning, not ending. As she glanced down, she saw Caleb tugging the hem of his miniature dress shirt. He looked freshly bathed, hair parted to the side, just like he liked it. Socks that didn't match. He held a dinosaur toy in one hand, and in the other, her hand, the anchor she didn't always feel worthy to be. "Do I look okay, Mama?" he asked. Danielle knelt down on one knee. "You look like $1,000,000, baby." He giggled. "That's good, right?" She kissed his forehead softly. "It's the best." There was no doubt in her heart that even just walking into that office today would mean something. Not for a paycheck, not for recognition, but for every woman who had been dismissed before they could even speak. For every mother told that her child was the reason she couldn't rise. For every black woman whose strength was mistaken for anger and whose story no one had cared to hear. She wasn't just walking in for herself anymore. She was walking in for all of them. When Danielle and Caleb stepped inside the Harper and Lane building for the second time, everything felt the same, but she was not. The same marble floors, the same cold modern lighting, same reception desk. Only this time, the receptionist stood up as they entered. "Good morning, Miss Thomas," she said politely. Danielle blinked. The woman's voice was void of the mocking tone from before. Caleb looked up at her, surprised too, as the woman continued. "Mr. Reed is expecting you. His office is on the 18th floor. Private elevators just to the right." It felt odd being spoken to with respect in a place where she had been silently shamed just days ago. She took a deep breath, muttered something soft under her breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a mantra, and stepped inside the elevator. As they rose, floor by floor, Danielle's memories tried to rise with them. Every job that passed her up, every interview that ended before it started, every rejection letter that praised her efforts but offered no future. When the elevator doors finally opened, she expected more cold glass and silence. Instead, she was met with the warm scent of coffee, a front desk assistant smiling with genuine welcome, and a hallway covered in framed photos. Diverse hands working together, team retreats, campaign launch events full of joy and laughter. And there, waiting in front of a glass-walled office door, stood Jonathan Reed. Tall, gray suit, no tie, hands resting in his pockets. He looked down and smiled kindly at Caleb, then up at Danielle with a warmth that was deeply human. Not stale professionalism. "Miss Thomas," he said, "you brought the young man with you. I was hoping you would." Danielle managed a shaky laugh. He insisted on dressing up. Jonathan knelt before Caleb and offered a handshake. "You know, it takes a pretty strong hero to get dressed for business at your age." Caleb beamed and shook his hand. Danielle watched this scene with quiet astonishment, not because it was dramatic or grand, but because it was so ordinary. She had grown so used to being an outsider that being treated like she belonged felt almost strange. Jonathan led them inside and offered Caleb a little table with coloring books. A staff member gently brought him apple juice. Danielle sat down across from Jonathan at a massive desk, her body straight, but her shoulders softening for the first time in a long time. "I owe you an apology," Jonathan began. Danielle blinked. "What for?" "I've run this company for nearly a decade," he said. "I spend half my time preaching values and strategy and progress. But 3 days ago, I saw something I've seen too much of and done too little about." There was silence. not awkward, but reflective. I saw a woman show up, he continued, pausing just for a breath. Fully prepared, completely composed, with more strength than most of us carry through any given day. But she was turned away, because people saw her child as a burden instead of her badge of victory. Danielle's throat closed slightly. Tears wanted to rise, but she held them back. Jonathan leaned in. I read your resume. I called a nonprofit you work with. They raved about you, not because you made content, because you brought heart to the table. She stayed silent, overwhelmed. I'm offering you a position, he said, starting next week. Full-time marketing assistant, remote flexibility, mentorship, child care reimbursement. And one more thing. Danielle's eyebrows furrowed gently, almost afraid to hear more in case this was all just a dream. I'm launching a pilot program, he continued, for hiring single mothers, especially from underrepresented communities with non-traditional resumes. I want you to help me build it. That was the moment Danielle broke. The tears came quickly, not loud or messy, just a quiet stream she couldn't stop, her hands covering her face for just a second before she lifted them to wipe calmly. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means. Jonathan stood, walked around a table like he would with any colleague, and shook her hand firmly, respectfully. Yes, he replied. I do. Behind them, Caleb had drawn something on paper, a stick figure of him, his mom, and a tall man with a cape. He held it up proudly. This one's me. That's Mommy. And that's you, you're helping us. Jonathan chuckled and took the drawing. I've never had a cape before. Danielle smiled through wet lashes, and for the first time in her life inside corporate walls, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt chosen, deserving, equal. By the time they walked out that afternoon, sun still shining, Danielle didn't walk like a woman desperate for work. She walked like a woman walking into her purpose, not because someone gave it to her, because someone unlocked what was always there. It had been 6 months. 6 months since Danielle Thomas had walked through those polished glass doors with nothing but a trembling resume, the hand of her 5-year-old son, and a heart full of hope. 6 months since she had been quietly cast aside in shame. And 6 months since someone saw her worth before she even had a chance to speak it. Now, as she stepped into that same lobby, she walked differently, not just because her heels were steadier or her blazer was newer, but because something in her had shifted. Her head was higher, not out of pride, but peace. Her eyes weren't searching for approval anymore. They glowed with quiet certainty, because she had earned her place. Danielle was no longer the woman being dismissed before the interview. She was now Harper and Lane's community engagement strategist, leading the very project she once prayed to be a part of. What began as a simple job, offer had grown into something more, a platform, a purpose, and a new chapter for women like her. Her desk now sat by a window overlooking the city, the kind of view she once believed belonged to someone else's life. But outside wasn't what mattered most. It was what was happening inside the walls. With Jonathan Reed's support, Danielle helped launch the company's Second Chance program, a paid internship track for single parents, returnees to the workforce, and workers from historically overlooked backgrounds. Not charity, not sympathy, equity, access, respect. Applicants didn't need perfect resumes. They needed vision, character, and drive. 3 things Danielle knew you couldn't format into bullet points, but lived in the details most people never care to ask about. For the first time in her life, her scars were seen not as imperfections, but as proof she had survived. Outside the corporate world, Danielle had begun to speak more. She still wasn't comfortable with the spotlight, but she knew her story wasn't just hers anymore. She started a blog called The Chair I Wasn't Given, where she spoke candidly about being a single black mother trying to break into white-collar spaces that were never designed with her in mind. Her words, raw, vulnerable, brave, began going viral, not because they were perfectly written, but because they came from truth. And truth always knows how to find its people. Other mothers began writing to her, women from Chicago to Oakland to Houston. Their stories were hauntingly familiar. Job interviews lost over strollers spotted in the lobby, assumed attitudes that were really just exhaustion, Talents buried under decades of trying to survive poverty, rejection, and a double-edged sword being both black and a woman. And every time Danielle replied, she didn't offer cliches. She offered understanding. You are not too much. You are not unprofessional for being a parent. You are not asking for charity when you ask for opportunity. You are powerful, even if they haven't learned how to see it yet. One cool autumn afternoon, Harper and Lane hosted their biggest internal event of the year, the Leadership Impact Forum. Normally, it was a room full of strategy talks, numbers, and sleek presentations. But this year, for the first time, the opening speaker wasn't CEO or head of finance. It was Danielle. She stood behind a podium, palms slightly sweaty, heart pounding against a rib cage she had once taught to stay silent. And then she breathed in and told her story. She spoke not with anger, but grace, not to shame, but to educate. She walked the room through that day, the whisper at the front desk, the HR manager who didn't even hear her speak, and the moment she wrapped her arms around her son outside with no job and still had to say, "You didn't ruin anything." She spoke of how racism wasn't always shouted. Sometimes it was gently coded in policies, in offhand glances, in rules written to punish difference under the name of professionalism. She spoke of how kindness, one act of courage, had changed her life, not because someone saved her, but because someone stood with her long enough to let her be seen. She closed with this: I didn't need a handout. I needed someone to stop talking and start listening. I didn't come here today to impress you. I came here to remind you that every time you make space for someone who doesn't look like you, live like you, or speak like you, you're not lowering your standards. You're expanding the room. The room stood in applause long before she finished. Even the HR director who had once slighted her was in the back, red-eyed, convicted beyond words, because Danielle had done something nobody expected. She turned her rejection into a revelation. She made space for people who still hadn't found the courage to speak their pain aloud. And she did it with kindness, the kind that doesn't scream, but still shakes walls. That night, as Danielle tucked Caleb into bed, he looked at her with sleepy eyes. "Did they like your speech, Mama?" "I think they listened," she smiled, brushing hair from his forehead. "That's even better." He paused, blinking slowly. "Are you still going to work there forever?" She chuckled. Maybe one day Mommy will open her own business. Help more moms like me." He nodded as if approving the idea, already drifting toward dreams. As she walked out of the room, Danielle paused, staring at the quiet reflection of herself in the hallway mirror. Still the same woman, same skin, same stories. But now she was no longer being turned away at doors. She was holding them open for others. From that day on, her journey only grew. She went on to speak at universities, partnered with community programs, started a mentorship circle for single moms entering corporate spaces. She started being called inspiring, a word that now felt real, not just flattering. But more meaningful than any award or recognition was this: the hundreds of women who said, "I saw myself in your story, and now I believe I deserve more too." Danielle never asked for praise. She only asked for possibility, and she gave the world a reminder. Kindness isn't weakness. It's a force, and it leaves a legacy. All it took was one moment. One stranger who chose to see value where others saw inconvenience. One door opened that opened 100 more behind it. This was never just about a job interview. This was about a system, and a mother who refused to let it swallow her.